The original Game Boy line, extending into the Game Boy Color, lasted an entire 14 years before being discontinued in 2003. The Game Boy was the best-selling handheld at the time in the entire world, but it was becoming dated very quickly. The competition was already leaps and bounds ahead of what the Game Boy could do, which meant that Nintendo couldn't sit idly by any longer. In my original video on the Game Boy, I was led to believe that Nintendo had no real plans of releasing their new generation of handhelds, but they tried to in 1996, then again in 1998. Instead, they released the Game Boy Pocket and Color respectively, which were just quality of life updates to the original Game Boy, even if the Color was more capable. So finally came 2001. Nintendo has big plans for this year. This one came a few months later. So enter the Game Boy Advance. Never too little and never too late. The Game Boy Advance changed a lot when compared to the Game Boy Color, bringing us the best aspects of the now last generation handheld into the current gen. The Game Boy Advance features the same 2-button setup as the Color, but the A-B buttons now have more travel and do feel noticeably better than before. The D-pad has remained the same, but this is great because Nintendo was still making really good D-pads at this time, and they even kept to the same size as before. Start and Select were moved to the left side, which are now much more responsive than before. These buttons are much better. The power switch was moved to the bottom, likely to avoid any accidental triggers. Same with the volume and headphone jack, where they will remain undisturbed. We still just have a single stereo speaker, but this is a louder one than before. On the top, we get a new link port for a link cable and other accessories released later on. But for this generation of gaming, we have shoulder buttons, which add so much more potential to the kinds of games that can be played on this device. These buttons are not my favorites by any means, as they feel very mushy. There is a click when pressing these shoulder buttons, but they felt very cheap to me, as they are. The form factor changed to a more familiar one from the competition, now going into a landscape design. This is a very big deal because the Game Boy Advance feels more serious. It becomes much more comfortable than before, and as a result, it allows the shoulder buttons to be easy to reach. The display itself actually looks more similar to the Colors display, but when you turn it on, you get access to so much more. This display is also slightly larger, and it does feel different from before too, now featuring a resolution of 240 by 160 instead of 160 by 144 from the Game Boy Color, and can now feature 32,000 different colors. The Game Boy Advance is obviously much more powerful than the Game Boy Color, so it runs much more demanding games with some fringe 3D capabilities, similar to what we might see on something like the SNES. All of this was still possible under 2 AA batteries, with an increase in battery of up to 20 hours in total instead of the 10 hours tops that we got from the Game Boy Color. And all of this was also difficult to comprehend because this next generation handheld launched at $99 in 2001, which would be $175 in today's money. This was very cheap. But I can almost guarantee that this was possible because the Game Boy Advance did not have a backlit display, so Nintendo was able to make this handheld cheaper but much more efficient. Games were still difficult to see in darker rooms or at night, but this was perfectly playable during the day, and it did help when it came to preserving the battery life of this device for as long as possible, so everyone just dealt with it. Now it's the new generation of handheld gaming for Nintendo, so that means that we now get new cartridges too. These cartridges are now half the size of Game Boy games and hold up to 32 megabytes of game data for the game cartridges, but movie cartridges could hold up to 64 megabytes of data. These game cartridges did actually come with flash storage to save data, which doesn't die out in the same way that batteries did before. That means no save batteries and a very low chance of you losing your save data. No need to replace batteries for your saves. There are games that do need batteries for other purposes, such as with time-based events, which means that if the battery dies, you can still save your games, but whatever time-based events won't work in the game until you end up replacing it. However, by this point, Game Boy and Game Boy Color games were still perfectly playable, and even a better experience through the Game Boy Advance thanks to its backwards compatibility. Just about every single Game Boy game or Game Boy Color game works perfectly with the Game Boy Advance, but Game Boy games would be shrunken down and would be surrounded by black bars on the top and bottom in order to be shown in their original aspect ratio. The good news is that you can tap the L and R buttons to switch between stretched and original aspect ratios, but just keep it original, because the stretch mode only stretches horizontally and it looks terrible. But the Game Boy Advance would do the same tricks to original Game Boy games in order to give them color, so we would get anywhere between 4 to 10 colors on every single original Game Boy game. Game Boy Color games looked just as intended on a Game Boy Color, but on the Game Boy Advance, which means that they looked as expected from Game Boy Color with the extra details and would display many more colors than just 4 to 10. But speaking of games, the Game Boy Advance gave us so many games to play, and like with any handheld or console, this is what makes said platform shine. Games like Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission are very beloved games that gave us very fun platform shooters that I thought were kind of difficult, but if you know what you're doing, you can beat these games very quickly. Mario vs. Donkey Kong was a gem of this generation as well, because this game was such an interesting twist to the Mario formula that remains beloved to me, and many others. Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy VI, Golden Sun, and many more JRPGs of this category are also dearly beloved, as these are games with a lot of depth, lots of playability and things to do, as well as engaging players and fantastic stories, all in your pocket. The Legacy of Goku games are also very beloved, and I can attest to their greatness even to this day. The Sonic Advance games 1, 2, and 3 were also incredibly fun, and I did play for so many hours back in the day. Super Mario Land, Fire Emblem, Yoshi's Island, and the Mega Man games, Sonic Battle, and the third generation of Pokemon games such as Pokemon Greenleaf, Pokemon Ruby, Herbs, Sims in the City, A Link to the Past, Super Sonic Warriors, and I will stop right there because there's so many games that were so much fun on this platform, but I simply can't name them all. But the gaming experience was massively improved with the Advance model. The last generation felt very slow, with hardly much innovation to be seen between releases of every Game Boy model before. However, this was the generation where things moved way too quickly. Nintendo was stagnant with the Game Boy line of handheld, likely because the Game Boy Advance model had been in the works for so long. Finally, when Nintendo did release the Advance model, it did feel like it was pretty late into things, even if it did dominate the competition. Lots of things were outdated for that time, and that is especially true with the display itself. So only 1.5 years after the very successful release of the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo releases what I would consider to be the definitive version of the Game Boy Advance line, the Game Boy Advance SP. The Game Boy Advance SP is a much different handheld that just happens to play the same games as the Game Boy Advance with the same backwards compatibility standards from its older brother, but now it comes in a much smaller form factor. It has a powerful hinge that opens the console and allows for several viewing angles, with it clicking into its one intended position. The buttons were much different, as they had to fit well within the clamshell design. The D-pad has virtually the same footprint, but is much more recessed, and this time, it's clicky, which makes it feel so much more responsive. The AB buttons became smaller and much more recessed as well, which meant clicky buttons and instant feedback. Start and select are also very clicky and recessed. Everything is recessed on this console. And now the mono speaker sits right in the center of the main body. Volume and power switches were moved to the sides, while the link connector was moved to the top, right next to the newly added proprietary charging port, because now the SP model has a fully rechargeable battery. This marked the end of having to buy AA batteries every time our batteries died, other handhelds at least. And the shoulder buttons, in my opinion, are actually an improvement. Even with my small hands, I still have to adjust my grip to press them, unlike how it was with my Game Boy Advance where my fingers just reached naturally. But the shoulder buttons do feel better because they are clickier and are small enough to feel more solid. But the absolute biggest reason why you wanted an SP at the time simply had to be the display, because we finally get front-lit display. It still features the same 240 by 160 resolution display, but now we can actually see it in the dark. This made it possible to play anywhere, at any time of the day, and you could turn the front light on or off by pressing the new button in the center top of this handle, allowing you to use the front light only when you needed it. Because of this, every single game looked much better too, and this felt like a genuinely big improvement from the original Game Boy Advance. And with all of these quality of life improvements, they still launched this at $99 in 2003. However, Nintendo did release two models of the Game Boy Advance SP, the AGS 101 model with an actual backlight, and the AGS 001 model with just a front light. Both models are exactly identical, minus some minor color changes for the shell here and there, but the only differences to note on either model are the display and the battery life. I have never seen an AGS 101 in person, and I couldn't get it for this video in favor of something else, but they do look different. From what I've seen, the AGS 101 model was actually released later in 2005, and this is more of a revised display with a brighter screen and more saturated colors. The AGS 001 was the original one released in 2003 and has a more dim display with more muted colors, but the battery life is different because the AGS 101 model always has its backlight activated, while the AGS 001 model will allow you to turn off the backlight when you don't need it. Obviously, this will be based on personal preference, but I think it will both work fine under overly bright and underexposed scenarios. Just get used to it. Now, there was one concession made with this design, in fact, a couple of concessions. Some people would consider the buttons to be one of those concessions because they don't have as much travel, and for certain games, the feedback for certain movements is more noticeable, where now you either get great responsiveness or struggle to move the D-pad in the correct directions because the D-pad on this just isn't the same and has a lot less travel, nor is it as fluid. It's just an instant click, which to some isn't good enough. Same goes for the shoulder buttons because they are a lot smaller and much more uncomfortable to reach for a lot of people. But the other is that we lost the headphone jack, but me and a lot of other people would be fine with most of those concessions for every other improvement that we got. The Game Boy Advance SP was a very popular handheld, but Nintendo simply wasn't done with the Game Boy Advance line, even if the SP model was already so good at the time. Already, by the release of the SP model, this generation was ending for Nintendo, even though this was such a popular generation. There were so many games released in this generation, many were great, even if not all could reach those same heights, and by 2005, games were still being released for the Game Boy Advance. So Nintendo made one final push within the barely 4 years that the Game Boy Advance has been alive for, introducing a handheld that largely flew under the radar. It's now September of 2005, and the Game Boy Micro finally enters the scene. The Game Boy Micro is the most interesting version of the Game Boy Advance, and somehow I've never held one until I purchased one for this video. This is because while there are millions of units in circulation, this model remained largely ignored by most people, launching at $99 just as its previous models did. The Game Boy Micro lives up to its name as it is exceptionally small, being only 4 inches long and 2 inches tall. Because of the shrinking of the Game Boy Advance being so drastic, everything changed with this release. This device was also built very well, and it has a surprising amount of heft for its size. The start and select buttons were moved towards the bottom and even light up, now being very clicky. The speaker was reduced greatly in size and the sound quality suffered as a result. The power switch is now at the bottom, along with the cartridge slot and the headphone jack. Volume controls were moved to the right and now features clicky buttons to make volume adjustments. The Micro even notifies you when you're increasing the volume by beeping quietly and does so in a different way once you've reached max volume. We also get a charging port on top, which is not to be mistaken as being a mini HDMI port. Obviously, no one made that mistake in 2005. The shoulder buttons were made much longer now and are still on the clicky side. The D-pad was made slightly smaller and no longer has the more textured design of the original Game Boy Advance, now having a slick design with a little more travel than the SP model's D-pad. The face buttons were also made smaller, but now have a little more travel than before. These buttons do feel somewhat slippery, but of course, the display had to be made much smaller. The original Advance model has a 2.9-inch display. The Game Boy Micro only has a 2-inch display. While fostering the same hardware for the most part, because now you cannot play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on this system. Those cartridges simply will not lock in. Additionally, you've lost the ability to play multiplayer games or to connect any accessories to your Game Boy. So with the Micro, the Advance model was stripped of everything but its essentials. Now this next part is just my opinion, but because the Game Boy Micro screen is of the same resolution as the Game Boy Advance's, while being much smaller, it does allow games to look better, and this is also helped by the fact that we still have a backlit display on the Game Boy Micro. I never had any issues reading UI elements on the Micro, and I actually quite enjoyed gaming on it. Additionally, watching movies on this model was a surprisingly good experience because of this display. It's actually quite bright and looks much better than the AGS-001 SP screen. As awesome as it was to have a full Game Boy Advance that could fit so well in your pockets along with a couple of games, there are too many compromises made here. This is not an ergonomic device, and even for my small hands, I have to readjust my grip depending on what buttons I need to reach. If you stick to turn-based games, this does not matter. But for action-based games that use the triggers, this is hard to play. But maybe not so much for a child, who this is intended for, by the way. The Game Boy Micro is rated for anywhere between 6 to 10 hours of playtime, which isn't that bad for my liking, even if it gives you less hours of playtime before charging than the original or the SP model. Nintendo was also pretty experimental at this time because they made the Micro to be customizable. You can swap the front plate for any design that becomes available and give your Micro the kind of flair that it just didn't have from the factory. The Micro is the least popular model of the main 3 versions of the Game Boy Advance by a large margin. This one is also my favorite, but this is the most expensive one to get as of the posting of this video, and the one that just isn't worth it today because of the missing features. I also suspect that it didn't sell very well at all because of the launch price, as it was the same as the Game Boy Advance's original pricing while having missing features and already being in the midst of being phased out. Regardless of this final send-off to the Game Boy Advance, this line of handhelds absolutely exploded in popularity, selling around 81 million units before being discontinued in 2009. Some of the most nostalgic games were released exclusively for the Game Boy Advance line, and these are games that are now worth more than the handhelds themselves on the used market. So to say that the Game Boy Advance was an absolute success is still a huge understatement. By just 2004, the rest of the competition in the handheld market basically tapped out, with only Sony remaining. And as short-lived as the hardware from the Game Boy Advance was in terms of support, this is still one of people's favorite handhelds to collect for. Nintendo more than dominated. They almost became the only option. The Game Boy Advance SP is the only one that still gets some attention from me these days, as my SP now lives inside of this boxy pixel aluminum shell. However, as the Game Boy Advance line came so late into the current generation at the time, it was starting to be phased out just a few short years later. This is probably my second favorite generation of handheld gaming, just behind the one that came immediately after. I'm dying to talk about this one, but there are so many others that I want to talk about before we get there, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.